There's been a lot of recognition concerning the importance of emotional management, or what's also called emotional intelligence, controlling your emotions. You know, a lot of people have recognized that emotional thinking can be extremely problematic for people, right? This has been known for centuries, and people continue to write and talk about it to this day. But what I find is a lot of that conversation or a lot of that analysis is confused, and a lot of it contradicts itself, where they tell you this emotion is good sometimes but bad other times. The basic mainstream view on emotions, as I see it, is that you basically just want to keep them in moderation. Something like anger, generally speaking, is not beneficial, but occasionally it can be productive. Same with fear. They'll tell you, generally speaking, yes, fear is not advantageous, but sometimes it's helpful. It keeps you safe, right? Or even they'll speak of craving in a way that is relativistic, meaning like, yes, generally speaking, like a selfish craving train of thought is not beneficial, but sometimes you do need to be a real go-getter, or what have you. They'll associate like being um, lively and productive and giving effort to achieve your dreams with craving, and so they make it seem as though sometimes a little bit of craving is actually a good thing, right? So in various ways, what I would classify as purely toxic emotions, they're portrayed as bad most of the time, but not all of the time. And that's considered the intelligent perspective. But as I've made clear, at least I hope I've made clear in my previous talks on fear, for example, as one of these toxic emotions to analyze, the devil is in the details, meaning if you actually analyze the so called excuses, or exceptions, I should say, the exceptions to the rule of it being completely toxic. If you look into these so called exceptions, like with fear, that it's sometimes good because it keeps you safe, like if you actually look into that and use some sound logic, you realize that doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny. That's actually false. Fear doesn't help you even in a dangerous situation. And I won't belabor that point because I've already talked about it at length. What I wanted to just briefly share here, three examples of true emotional intelligence as expressed by Jesus. So these are quotes of Jesus where he's talking about emotions, three in particular: fear, anger, and craving. So the three I started this talking about, right? And let's hear what he has to say, and you can compare it with, again, the mainstream view that, oh, these are sometimes good. So let's start with fear. And one thing to recognize firstly is that worry is a form of fear. So when he's speaking against worry, he's speaking against fearful thinking. That's not a false equivalency, that's an accurate equivalency. Worry is definitely a form of fear. So in Matthew 6:25, Jesus said to not worry about your life. He said, "Do not worry about your life." Okay? So he didn't say don't worry most of the time. Unless your life is in danger, then it's good to worry. There's no asterisks, there's no exception. He just said, do not worry about your life, period, no matter what. And he even went into other detail about, food, clothing, and shelter, basically, to paraphrase, the basic necessities of life. Like, even if you are concerned about that, like, you don't know how you're going to survive, right? Which is safety related. Even then, it doesn't do you any good. And just to make it even more clear, a couple verses later in Matthew 6:27, he said something very interesting, that deserves further contemplation. When I first heard this verse, I thought it was interesting and profound, but I didn't realize how profound it is. And the words of Jesus are oftentimes like that to the reader. You don't realize the depth of it the first time you hear it or the first time you read it. So he said in verse 27, can you add any time to your life by worrying? That's like a modern English translation. Can you add, some translations say, can you add a moment of time or a day of your life? Can you add a day to your life through worry? So what does that mean? A fair basic translation could be something like, well, it's unproductive, right? He's saying you're not adding any time to your life. In other words, you're not adding anything of value to your life. And what I realized was so profound is that his choice of focusing on time as a example of something valuable, because he gave us what is oftentimes, and rightly, I think it's correct to say, is actually your most valuable possession, right? Your time. You may have heard people, religious and non-religious alike, say things like, time is your most valuable commodity or your most valuable asset, right? You only have so much in this lifetime, and when you lose it, you can't gain it back, right? Like, time is precious, right? Treat your time with respect and let other people know that they need to respect your time as well, right? So when he focused in on time as an example of something valuable in your life, that was a profound choice of an example of something valuable in your life, right? He could have given other examples, but he chose time. So to return to the main point about fear, is that it's completely unproductive. It doesn't add anything to your life. It doesn't help you in a survival scenario. And he also told us that it has negative spiritual consequences as well. In Revelation 21:8, he lists cowards as the first group of people. It's the first type of person that he mentions as being disqualified from entrance into heaven, and instead facing suffering for being outside of God's will. So who is a coward? A coward is someone who is led by fear, right? A cowardly person is the opposite of a courageous person, right? And courage is the virtue that opposes the sin of fear. So very strong, clear teaching against fear, as opposed to, again, the mainstream that makes it out to be something sometimes good and sometimes bad. And they'll tell you that it serves an evolutionary purpose, and that our ancestors would have never survived if it wasn't for fear, because they couldn't perceive danger without it. They would have just kept their hand in the fire, or they would have just walked off the cliff because they had no ability to assess a danger, right? If there was a growling saber-toothed tiger, they would themselves, oh, look at the cute little kitten. I'm going to walk over to it and pat it on the head, right? It's without that fear, that would have led them, being without fear would have led them to be stupid in an extreme way, to the point of just doing all kinds of extremely dangerous things, right? It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. You can recognize something is dangerous and choose to not partake in it out of your own self-interest, right? When you're driving down the road, you're not afraid, hopefully not, you're not afraid of every car that passes you. And so that's what keeps you in your lane. You choose to be in your lane because you don't want to get into a crash, right? It's just logical self-preservation. You don't need fear to not do extremely dangerous things. To say otherwise is nonsense. Okay, now let's go to anger and hear what Jesus said about anger. In Matthew 5:22, he said, I tell you that anyone who is angry with someone will be subject to the judgment. That judgment being the negative judgment of God, right? So, again, notice that there aren't any exceptions given. It's not like, unless someone does something bad and then anger is good, right? This idea of like righteous anger. The thing to understand is, just because you get angry, just because you get angry at something that really is wrong, that doesn't mean that the anger is actually productive, right? So you saying, oh, well, that really is an injustice, doesn't mean that the anger is a productive means of combating the injustice, right? So it's this flawed thinking, once again, where people are apparently, temporarily unable to recognize the point that there are productive means of dealing with an injustice, and then there are unproductive means. And for whatever reason, they can't fathom the possibility that anger belongs in the unproductive category. They think, oh, well, sometimes I get angry at real bad things, so therefore anger must be good because it arose in response to a bad thing. But that's not necessarily true. It can just be a poor reaction to a real problem, right? Just because you have a reaction to a real problem doesn't mean that that reaction is automatically a good and correct one. Basic reasoning here. Part of the problem too is all of the nonsense, all the bullshit taught by mainstream universities and, education and so-called experts that basically fall on this appeal to nature logical fallacy, where they think, well, why would we even have it if it didn't serve some evolutionary purpose, right? They say the same thing about fear. Well, why would fear even exist unless it served some good purpose? right? So they have this assumption, and that's the irrationality of it. They have this assumption that anything that exists in the natural world, including our own minds and bodies, must serve some good purpose. So if you're holding that thinking, because that's what you were taught, you should ask yourself, how do I know that's true? Why am I assuming? Why is it intelligent to assume that just because something exists in nature, it's beneficial? Why would you make that assumption? There's no rational reason to assume that everything in nature is beneficial. And to just jump on it's an evolutionary, you know, it's serving this evolutionary purpose. It sounds kind of legit if you don't think about it, if you just appeal to authority and say, oh, well, they sound so confident when they tell me this. And yeah, I guess it makes sense, like beneficial things would get passed on, right? So you just have this simplistic perspective that excludes the possibility that there's always been, or at least for, this period, this epoch of human time, there's been elements of evil. There's been elements of, you could say, poisonous, toxic, spiritual and physical realities that are not actually beneficial and are, you could say, in a sense, here for us to turn away from, right? So that we can make a choice between good and bad, right? That's not even considered as a possibility. Like, oh, evil existing in the world as a test of my morality? What? No, that can't be possible. It must just be serving this evolutionary purpose, even though it doesn't even make sense on an experiential level, even though I can't actually pinpoint how fear or anger or craving are ever actually beneficial. I'm just going to run with this Darwinian bullshit because it fits my atheistic paradigm. Anyway, continuing on with anger, the brother of Jesus echoed his teaching when he said in James 1:20, human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Very clear cut. Does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So it's not that God does not desire righteousness. It's saying that anger is not the means of producing said righteousness. It's unproductive, just like fear. Okay, maybe this is what Jesus was talking about when he said, he who conquers, right? He who conquers all of these lies and he who overcomes these evils, will gain of the fruit of the tree of life. Finally, craving, and lust, of course, being a form of craving. In Matthew 5:28, Jesus said, I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his mind. So here he's saying that the craving thought itself is sinful, right? And again, he's not saying, well, sometimes the craving thought is okay. It's just, you could say, condemnation or classification of that kind of thinking as purely bad, as toxic or demonic. So that's real emotional intelligence that isn't corrupted by and dumbed down and made irrational by moral relativism, which is, the so-called wisdom of modern society, pushed by basically a satanic system, to just go on a slight tangent of perspective there. And interestingly, in another tradition in Buddhism, there's this image called the Wheel of Samsara. And it portrays this kind of monster, this demon, who actually is considered the devil. They call the devil Mara in that tradition, but basically it's the devil, the adversary, Satan, holding this giant wheel showing like all kinds of human scenarios or levels of human existence. The very center of the wheel are these three creatures that are called the three poisons, which are said to basically be the engine of the wheel. Those are the factors that make the wheel of suffering turn. And those three animals symbolically correspond to these three emotions. In that tradition, they call, instead of saying anger, they say aversion. And instead of saying craving, they say attachment. And instead of saying worry or fear, it's just called delusion or ignorance. And you might say, well, how is that the same? Well, remember that Jesus pointed out how if you follow fear, you're ignorant, right? You're ignorant of the fact that it doesn't add anything of value to your life. So anytime you actually cling to a fearful thought, you're exercising ignorance. You're being ignorant. Because if you weren't ignorant of the reality of fear, that it's completely unproductive, as Jesus said it is, why would you follow it, right? It's only because you're ignorant of that truth. It's only because you've been deceived into believing the lie that it's sometimes good that you cling to it in the first place, right? Because otherwise, why would you do that? Unless you're a crazy masochist, right? Most people are not going to want to do something that's going to harm them and make their life worse. So, in conclusion, Jesus expressed true emotional intelligence by pointing us to the completely toxic and demonic qualities of anger, fear, and craving. I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for listening.